فليتفضل.
6 months after the dramatic fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in December 2024, Syria remains a volatile mosaic of competing factions, sectarian tensions, and foreign influences, with the West's backing of interim President Ahmed al-Sharaa and the broader regime change experiment yielding mixed results at best. The promise of a unified, stable, and democratic Syria under al-Sharaa's leadership, once heralded by Western powers as a triumph over authoritarianism, has been overshadowed by persistent violence, economic collapse, and a lack of cohesive governance. The West's support for al-Sharaa, a former leader of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham (HTS) rebel group with roots in jihadist movements, has not translated into meaningful progress, leaving Syria teetering on the edge of further chaos. The current situation in Syria. Syria today is a fractured state grappling with the aftermath of a 14-year civil war and the abrupt collapse of the Assad regime. The interim government, led by Ahmed al-Sharaa, was established in January 2025 following a rebel offensive spearheaded by HTS, with significant backing from Turkey and tacit approval from Western powers, including the United States and the United Kingdom. Al-Sharaa's government, which announced a new constitutional declaration in March 2025, was initially seen as a chance to rebuild Syria's gutted institutions and steer the country towards stability. However, the reality on the ground tells a different story. Sectarian violence has surged, particularly in southern and coastal regions. In Sweida province, clashes between Druze militias and Sunni Bedouin tribes have resulted in significant casualties, with Syrian troops deployed to quell the unrest, only to face Israeli airstrikes aimed at protecting the Druze community. In the coastal region of Latakia, sectarian massacres targeting Alawites, Assad's minority sect, have left hundreds, possibly thousands dead, with reports of 1,500 Alawites killed in a single wave of violence in March 2025. These attacks, attributed to pro-Assad loyalists and possibly fueled by Iranian-backed groups, highlight the deep divisions that continue to plague Syrian society. The economy remains in tatters, with 90% of Syrians living below the poverty line and 70% reliant on humanitarian aid. The Syrian pound has lost 99% of its value, and half of the country's infrastructure lies in ruins. While Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE have pledged investments to stabilize Syria, American sanctions, partially lifted by the Trump administration in May 2025, continue to hinder economic recovery. The return of Syrian refugees, encouraged by a UN-backed plan offering financial incentives, has begun, but the lack of security and basic services makes reintegration precarious. Geopolitically, Syria is a battleground for competing interests. Turkey, a key backer of the HTS-led offensive, has emerged as a dominant player, offering to train Syria's new armed forces and eyeing the return of 2.9 million Syrian refugees hosted in Turkey. Israel, wary of al-Sharaa's Islamist roots, has maintained a military presence in southern Syria and conducted strikes to counter perceived threats, including Iranian-backed proxies. Meanwhile, Iran, weakened by the fall of Assad and Israeli attacks on its regional assets, is reportedly supporting anti-regime elements to undermine al-Sharaa's government. Russia, once a major ally of Assad, is being sidelined, with Damascus cancelling a port management contract with Moscow in favour of Dubai Ports World. The West's role and al-Sharaa's inaction. The West, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, played a pivotal role in legitimizing al-Sharaa's regime. The Trump administration's decision to lift most US sanctions in May 2025, coupled with a $7 billion energy deal involving a Qatari-US-Turkish consortium, signaled strong Western support for the new government. The UK, under Foreign Secretary David Lammy, re-established diplomatic relations with Damascus, pledging £94.5 million, $129 million, in aid. These moves were framed as efforts to stabilise Syria and counter Iranian influence, with al-Sharaa's pledges to prevent attacks on Israel and form an inclusive government earning him cautious Western endorsement. However, al-Sharaa's leadership has been marked by inertia and unfulfilled promises. Despite his rhetoric of unity and inclusivity, the interim government struggles to govern effectively. The formation of a 23-minister cabinet in March 2025, intended to reflect Syria's diverse ethnic and religious makeup, has been criticised as a superficial gesture, with key positions still dominated by HTS loyalists. The government's response to sectarian violence has been inadequate, with security forces often exacerbating tensions through heavy-handed tactics. For instance, the deployment of troops to Sweida led to further clashes, and the failure to address Alawite massacres has fueled accusations of complicity or negligence. Al-Sharaa's pledge to hold elections within 5 years remains vague, with no clear roadmap for democratic transition. The dissolution of judicial institutions tied to the Assad regime has left a legal vacuum, with former judges and civil servants expressing frustration over lost livelihoods. Meanwhile, the persistence of Islamic State, IS, activity, including a suicide bombing at a Greek Orthodox church in Damascus on June 22, 2025, underscores the government's inability to secure the country. Al-Sharaa's focus on consolidating power and navigating foreign alliances has left domestic governance in disarray, with little progress on rebuilding infrastructure or addressing the humanitarian crisis. Effects of the West's regime change. The West's push for regime change, culminating in Assad's ouster, was driven by a desire to weaken Iran's regional influence and install a government amenable to Western interests. However, the outcomes have been far from the stable, pro-Western Syria envisioned. The power vacuum left by Assad's fall has intensified sectarian divisions, with Alawites, Druze, and other minorities facing violence and marginalization. The rise of al-Sharaa, a figure with ties to Al-Qaeda and HTS, has raised concerns about the potential for an Islamist-leaning government despite his efforts to project moderation. Israeli fears of an anti-Israel regime persist, prompting ongoing military operations in Syrian territory. Turkey's growing influence, bolstered by its support for HTS, has shifted Syria's orientation toward Ankara and away from traditional allies like Iran and Russia. This realignment, while aligning with Western goals of countering Iran, has complicated Syria's internal dynamics as Turkish-backed groups in the north clash with Kurdish-led forces in the northeast. The US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, have negotiated with Damascus, but remain wary of al-Sharaa's intentions, fearing marginalization in a centralized state. The humanitarian crisis, exacerbated by years of war and sanctions, shows no signs of abating. While Gulf investments offer hope, their impact is limited by ongoing instability and bureaucratic hurdles. The return of refugees, while symbolically significant, risks overwhelming an already strained system, with reports of displaced families struggling to find shelter or employment. Social media sentiment, particularly on platforms like X, reflects deep skepticism of the West's role. Some users accuse the US and UK of hypocrisy for supporting a regime led by a former Al-Qaeda affiliate, pointing to al-Sharaa's alleged involvement in past atrocities. Others argue that Western interference, including billions in aid to rebel groups, has prolonged Syria's suffering, with one user describing it as a catastrophe fueled by Western betrayal. These voices, while not conclusive, highlight a broader distrust of the West's motives and the legitimacy of al-Sharaa''s government.